Oh, we can do it at the end.
I could actually get through these last three chapters to the finale chapter, but we'll see. Probably not. It never goes as quickly as I think it will. So, all right. Uh, so, chapter 12, we got through, but let me read through that as we get to the end of that one. Kind of sets up those last three that we're looking at, all have the same theme. But you should receive all who come in the name of the Lord. Then, putting him to the test, you will know, for you have discernment of the worthy and false through the Holy Spirit. If the one coming is passing through, help him as you are able. He shall not remain with you more than 2 or 3 days if necessary. But if he wishes to dwell among you, having a skill, he should work and eat. But if he does not have a skill, take thought according to your understanding, so that he should not live lazy with you as a Christian. If he does not wish to do this, he is a Christ dealer. Beware of such persons. There's the word that the whoever wrote this uh, invented for this situation: Christ salesman, Christ dealer. Uh, so Paul talked rather extensively about this subject in several places, and I kind of wanted to go through what he said because this is basically the same setting that Paul made through uh, his discussions of this topic, and it's um, there's a lot of understanding about how the church was working at the time in these first early days in this. So, first place, First Thessalonians, as far as we can surmise, is the oldest book we have in the New Testament. It was Paul's first epistle, and this little bit is stuck into there. He says, "So we had such affection for you that we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God." Meaning, he had a job. He was working to provide for himself. Uh, they were working to provide for themselves there. They weren't leeching off of everybody around them, and at the same time proclaiming the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. So when Paul went the first time to Thessalonica, he got a job. He had a skill. He was a leather worker, uh, often called a tent maker, but the word that describes that is not as specific as tent maker. He worked he did various things uh, that involved um, the skill of you know putting things together in essence. Uh, and so he was working to provide for himself. He ate because he worked, not because he was a traveling apostle. And so he also, when he wrote his second letter to the Thessalonians, he went into a little more detail about this. In chapter 3 of Second Thessalonians, he said, "Now we command you, brothers, in the name of the Lord Jesus, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness and not in accord with the tradition that you receive from us." So, one of the things that Paul taught was that everybody had to work to provide for themselves and not walk in idleness. He uses himself as an example. "For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us, because we were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you." So that's the same thing he said in the first letter. He didn't want to be a burden to them. Uh, and there's a principle here which he continues to go into. It was not because we do not have that right, but to give
you in ourselves an example to imitate. For even when we were with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. And so Paul didn't want to come into these situations and proclaim himself an apostle and worthy of your support, and then just sit around and do whatever and preach the gospel on the side. He went in there, and rather than be a burden to the people and create some sort of enmity there because he was living off of them and not doing anything, he went to work and showed the people how he was willing to work and preach the gospel to avoid being the burden to them. So um, as we go through this in 2 Corinthians, you're going to see in detail what he's talking about and why he was like this. He says, so if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. And then he says, for we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busybodies. Now, that word busybodies is carries a lot of baggage with it in English. That's not really a good translation for what this says. So these people that he's talking about weren't working the way they were supposed to be working. So not busy at all, not busy at work means they weren't busy at working for their own jobs. And then what it says, that what the Greek word that's translated busybodies means there is that they were working with everyone else. In other words, what they were doing is, instead of focusing on what they were supposed to be doing, they were going around helping everybody else. And so they were taking from other people by asking people if they had things they could do for them, in essence. They were going from place to place, and instead of getting their own occupation, living off of other people by trying to get work with other people so they didn't have to develop their own livelihood themselves. They were leeching off of other people, but not in the same. And so this notion of busybodies, when we think of busybodies, we think of people spreading rumors. That's what a busybody does for. Well, if you're going from place to place and working from place to place and just working here and working there, you're doing that too, because you're always telling stories. This is the way I feel it probably is. You're telling stories about how when I worked with this guy for 3 days and then he fired me.
You're always telling him how to do his job.
So there is that connotation to it, but you get the idea of the kind of person that I'm talking about. Instead of developing their own careers, in essence, which is probably a sophisticated way of talking about what was going on in the first century, but instead of getting their own way, they were kind of living off of other people's industry. So, the warning, verse 12, now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their own work quietly and to earn their own living. So that's how you kind of see what the context is for what's going on there in verse 11. The encouragement that Paul gives them is to go find their own work, make their own living, not taking it from others. Now, in 1 Corinthians, almost this entire chapter involves this idea, and he gets into some strong detail here. Now, so just to kind of set this up, in Thessalonians, you get the idea that Paul is expecting everybody to work, including himself. So he has to go get a job and work because that's what you do, and then preach the gospel on the side. Well, that's not really his concept. What he's saying, and this is going to come out in detail here, is that he did that so he wouldn't be a burden to people, so his ministry would be more effective. But he did have the right to just go in there and say, I'm an apostle, you need to keep me up. So here's how this works. 1 Corinthians 9, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If To others I am not an apostle, at least to you I am, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. So this is just kind of setting up where he's going here. Even if some people didn't think Paul was an apostle, at least the Corinthians would have thought he was an apostle because he had proven his apostleship to them. Now remember, this word apostle can either mean just generally somebody sent forth, or it could be a title. And in this case, Paul is really more or less applying it as a title, that Paul is equating himself with the disciples who became apostles. Because there would have always been, because Paul didn't walk with Jesus, there was always going to be this notion everywhere he went that he was not quite an apostle like the apostles were the apostles. And that's kind of what I think is coming through here. So he first sets himself up as an apostle. At least to the Corinthians, he served the purpose, he performed the occupation of apostle. And then he goes on. So, with that said, do we not have, and he's including all of those in his group that were traveling with him, do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? So the idea, obviously, is that Paul and Barnabas and those who were doing that task were deserving of being kept up. That was their job. And so they had a right to eat and drink and to be taken care of. So verse 5 has a lot of stuff in it that you need to catch as you go through it. If you just read through it, you don't notice these things. So at the end of it there, it's talking about the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas. So remember, Jesus had brothers, of which James was one of those brothers. So those are the people in the Jerusalem church who had the important positions. These were the pillars, as he calls them in another place. These are the people that nobody questioned whether or not they were apostles. So the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas. Cephas is the Aramaic word for Peter. That was actually Peter's real name that Jesus gave him, from Simon to Cephas, because that is the Aramaic word for his name, Rock, that Jesus gave him. So there is some discussion on the fringes of whether or not Peter and Cephas were two different people, but there seems to be no reason to believe that Cephas is just not the word that Paul uses in most cases for Peter. So we're talking about those apostles, and he starts off this verse by saying, do we not have the right to take along a believing wife? So first of all, when traveling, if they brought along a wife who would have been a believer, she was part of the group to be kept up. But the interesting word here is we. Because I think we've kind of gotten accustomed to the notion that Paul was single. But here he says, do we not have the right? It's very likely that this we is just Paul talking, and saying in general, apostles traveling around with a wife would be worthy of having their wife supported. But it also may indicate that Paul was married. Was being the operative word there, because if he was married, he does imply in other places that he no longer had a wife. And it seems to be the notion also that if you take this and put it together with his discussions in other places about widows, and specifically where he talks about it was his wish that others would be even as him, but if he needed to marry, to marry. So when he said that, what he was talking about was he no longer, either never or no longer had a wife. And he thought it was a good idea if everybody stayed that way. If you didn't have a wife or a husband, you should not have a wife or husband. But he understood that people needed that. And so he also seems to be encouraging widows and widowers not to remarry, but to occupy themselves in the Lord. So it could be that that's what was his situation, that his wife, he'd been married and his wife had died, and he believed that if you achieve that situation, you should stay in that situation. Now, that does not mean that if you are, in our time, if you find yourself a widow or a widower, that you should remain that way. Paul had a reason for teaching that. Paul had a reason for teaching people not to get married at all. And we've talked about it before, recently. What should people be focused on completely? Spreading the gospel. Why was it so important to be focused intently on spreading the gospel right now? So why bother to get remarried if you're just going to go to heaven in 2 weeks? Remember, that's the way they're thinking. So that was the reason Paul probably was teaching the things the way he was teaching them in this sense, because you don't want to be distracted. That's what he talks about whenever he talks about having a wife or a husband. You're going to be occupied with keeping them happy. That's what he says. And you don't want to be distracted from spreading the gospel because we've got a very short window here. We're not going to be able to get enough people, get the gospel to enough people if we don't concentrate on what we're doing, because we've only got a month. So now there's a lot of extraction from what I'm telling you there, but that seems to be, if you take all the stuff Paul said, that seems to be what it was. Okay? So it's possible that Paul did have a wife at one time. We don't know that. But because he never comes right out and tells us. So, anyway, the idea being apostles have the right, and prophets, and we're going to see prophets and teachers and everybody else has a right to be kept up. But who serves as a soldier? So here's some more examples. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? If you're in the army, you don't have to go out and work to keep yourself up to be in the army. They take care of you. Who plants a vineyard without eating without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, for is it for oxen that God is concerned? So the law says don't muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. When it's grinding the grain there, don't put a muzzle on the ox so it can't eat. So if there's stray grain on the ground, the ox is entitled to eat that grain while it does its work. Because God is very concerned about oxen having a good life. That's not what, and so Paul's argument is it oxen that God is really concerned about? No, that's an example. The law is an example here, that those who work should be able to reap the benefits of their work. And so Paul's work, here's what he's saying, our work is the work of the gospel, so we should be able to reap benefits from that. Does he not certainly speak for our sake, or isn't he talking about us, is what he says. For it was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If you work in the crops, you should share in the crops. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? So Paul is making the point to them that they deserve to be maintained. But, nevertheless, even so, with all of that, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. So again, just like with the Thessalonians, here Paul says, we had a right to all of this, but we didn't exercise that right because we're not going to put an obstacle in the way of sharing the gospel. So even though Paul says it is a legitimate claim, Paul always put that to the side for the more important. So he went out and worked so that he wouldn't put a burden on people. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offering? So here, going back again to the Old Testament way, he points out that those who worked at the temple, the priests and the servants in the temple, got their food from the temple service. When people would bring in the sacrifices, they would put the sacrifices on the altar, in essence, cook them, and give them back except for a portion. They kept a portion for themselves to take care of themselves. Paul makes that example of what his job and those of the other apostles would be. In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. So again, he points out he didn't do it because he would rather die than have anyone deprive him of his ground for boasting. Now this is a little hard to translate, and so you get a different kind of feel from this last sentence than you probably should. First of all, in the Greek, it's kind of apparent that this is not really one sentence. He says, in essence, I would rather die than, and then he stops and kind of changes the thought a little bit and follows that up with, no one will deprive me of my boasting, is what he says. And what he means when he says no one will deprive me of my boasting is if his boasting is that he worked instead of being a burden on people. Instead of taking from people, he worked and provided for himself. And so the idea there is nobody's going to accuse me of being a deadbeat. That's what he means when he says no one's going to deprive me of my boasting. So nobody's going to have a charge against him. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. So he's not getting the boasting because he has no ground for boasting because he's preaching. That's not a good reason. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. So he's making a point here about what the gospel is really supposed to be, and what preaching the gospel is really supposed to be. If you're delivering the gospel, if you're an apostle, a prophet, whatever, this is the way it's supposed to be. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. So if you decide that you're going to do this job, be an apostle, a prophet, a preacher, or whatever, and you decide to do it yourself, then you have your own reward. It's no different than going out and getting another kind of job. So if you go out and get a job and somebody pays you for that, you have your reward. And he's saying that if you do that with apostleship, preaching, whatever, it's the same thing. But that's not the way it's supposed to work. But not of my own will. But if not of my own will, if I don't do it because I want to, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For, though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. So he says here that he's not being rewarded for what he's doing because he's preaching for free. He's doing it for free. He'd do it if nobody gave him anything. And he's obligated to do it. He's entrusted with a stewardship. So he has this obligation to do it, and he's getting to a point here. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. Going back up to verse 16. He doesn't preach because he wants to. He preaches because he has to. And woe to him if he doesn't preach. He's doing this because it's inside of him and it has to come out. And he's not doing it for the reward that he gets for doing it. He can't help himself.
He had a calling from the Lord.
Right. Which is different from if you decide you want to do it yourself. He has no choice to do it. It just happens. It just comes out. So he didn't decide one day he wanted to do this for a living. And that's the point he's making. If you decide you're going to do this for a living, you shouldn't be doing it. But if you can't help yourself and you would do it whether anybody gave you anything or not, then you should be doing it. In fact, you can't help but do it. That's the position Paul found himself in. That's what Paul was talking about. And you see, this is already in the Didache. You get exactly the same thing. But if he wishes to dwell among you, having a skill, he should work and eat. But if he does not have a skill, take thought according to your understanding, so that he should not live lazy with you as a Christian. So even if they don't have a skill, they need to do something. And so this is the idea. This is obviously the idea of the Christian community at this time. Is people were already seeing through this ruse, and they were already making the point that if somebody is doing this for the right reasons, this is not going to be a problem for them. Just like with Paul, they'll go out and get a job to be able to do what they want to do otherwise. And it's not your problem if they can't take care of themselves. But as Paul said, they are worthy because. And so here we're going to see, so we're getting ready to go to another chapter here that's going to talk in slightly different terms. And when we see this transition, again, it points out the idea that the guy who put together all of this into the Didache was going out and pulling it from different places. So you get these slight different nuances when you go from place to place in the Didache. So here the emphasis is on if somebody shows up and they act like they just want to lay around and not do anything and tell you about Jesus on the side and ask you to keep them up, put them back on the road. But if they're willing to work, then you know you got somebody. So you don't want any Christ dealers. Beware. Get rid of the Christ dealers. All right? All right. So just to set up for next week, we'll pick it up here next week, but this is chapter 13. Every true prophet wishing to reside with you is worthy of your food. Right. So here we have, and likewise, a true teacher. So we set up the fact that they should be willing to work, and now we're going to talk about, but they're worthy of not working if they're a true prophet.